In every era, people believe their wars are completely different from those that came before. When the machine gun appeared in the early 20th century, many believed warfare had fundamentally changed forever. When nuclear weapons were developed during the final days of World War II, some argued that the entire logic of war had been transformed. And today, with drones, satellites, cyber warfare, and artificial intelligence entering the battlefield, it is common to hear that we are witnessing a completely new form of conflict. But history suggests something more complicated. Technology certainly changes warfare. New weapons, new communication systems, and new forms of mobility can transform how battles are fought and how armies move. Yet, at the same time, many of the most important factors that determine victory or defeat remain surprisingly consistent across centuries. Armies still rely on supply lines. Commanders still struggle with uncertainty and incomplete information. Morale, leadership, organization, and political goals continue to shape outcomes in ways that technology alone cannot explain. In other words, modern warfare is both new and very old at the same time. In this video, we're going to explore what military history actually teaches us about warfare in the modern era, not by trying to predict the future, but by examining patterns that appear again and again across different conflicts. We will look at three major themes that historians and military scholars consistently identify. First, the relationship between technology and human factors in warfare. Second, the enduring importance of logistics and supply systems. And third, the limits of military power itself. These lessons appear across centuries, from the battlefields of ancient Rome to the industrial wars of the 20th century. Understanding them helps explain why some wars become long and difficult struggles, why some technologically advanced armies still fail, and why military power often produces results that are very different from what political leaders initially expect. To begin, we have to start with a question that has shaped military thinking for centuries. How much does technology actually determine the outcome of war? Technology and warfare, a revolution or continuity? Throughout history, new weapons have repeatedly created the impression that warfare has entered an entirely new era. When gunpowder weapons spread across Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries, military thinkers believed that the age of armored knights had ended forever. Fortifications were redesigned, armies reorganized, and the balance between offense and defense shifted dramatically. Centuries later, during the First World War, the scale of industrial weaponry shocked both soldiers and commanders. Machine guns, heavy artillery, barbed wire, and rapid-fire rifles created defensive firepower that made traditional offensive tactics extremely costly. This contributed to the long stalemate on the Western Front during the early years of the war. But even in that moment of technological shock, the deeper patterns of warfare remained recognizable. Armies still required leadership, coordination, discipline, and logistical support. The technological environment had changed, but the fundamental challenges of organizing and sustaining military forces had not disappeared. The same pattern can be observed in the Second World War. During this conflict, innovations such as radar, aircraft carriers, advanced submarines, and long-range strategic bombing all played major roles. Mechanized warfare transformed the speed and mobility of armies on land. The early German successes in campaigns such as the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the defeat of France in 1940 were often associated with what became known as blitzkrieg, a combination of tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving ground forces coordinated through radio communication. But even in these cases, technology alone did not determine outcomes. The effectiveness of these operations depended heavily on organization, planning, training, and the ability of commanders to coordinate different arms of the military. When those factors broke down, as they eventually did on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, the same technological advantages were no longer enough to guarantee success. This pattern has appeared repeatedly in modern conflicts. Advanced weapon systems can provide powerful advantages, but they rarely eliminate the importance of human decision-making. In many wars, the side that adapts its tactics, leadership structures, and logistics more effectively often gains the greater advantage, even when both sides have access to similar technologies. This relationship between technology and human factors has been recognized by many military historians. One common observation is that technology often changes the tools of warfare faster than organizations can adapt to them. When this happens, armies may possess powerful new weapons but still struggle to use them effectively. A clear historical example can be found in the early years of the First World War. European armies had access to machine guns and modern artillery, but their pre-war doctrines still emphasized rapid offensive movements inspired by 19th-century conflicts. The result was catastrophic losses during the opening campaigns of 1914. Only after several years of painful experience did military organizations begin to adapt their tactics to the new technological environment. Combined arms strategies, improved artillery coordination, infiltration tactics, and better communication systems gradually restored mobility to the battlefield by the later stages of the war. The key lesson here is that technology alone rarely determines how wars unfold. Instead, technology interacts with human factors such as leadership, doctrine, training, and organizational structure. When these elements align effectively, technological advantages can produce dramatic results. When they do not, even powerful weapon systems may fail to deliver the expected outcomes. This lesson remains relevant today. Modern military forces operate with extremely sophisticated technologies: satellite navigation, precision-guided weapons, advanced surveillance systems, and increasingly autonomous platforms. Yet the presence of these technologies does not remove the complexity of war. Commanders must still interpret uncertain information, coordinate large organizations, and operate within political constraints imposed by governments. History shows that these human and organizational factors often play a decisive role in determining whether technological advantages translate into strategic success. But technology is only one part of the larger picture. Another factor, often less visible but equally critical, has shaped the outcome of wars for thousands of years: logistics. The enduring importance of logistics. One of the most consistent lessons in military history is that armies depend on supply systems. Soldiers require food, ammunition, fuel, equipment, medical support, and transportation. Without these resources, even the most capable fighting force cannot operate for long. Because of this, logistics has often been described as the foundation of military power. This reality was already understood in ancient times. Roman armies, for example, relied on carefully organized supply systems supported by roads, depots, and administrative structures. These logistical networks allowed Roman forces to campaign across vast territories for extended periods. Similarly, during the campaigns of the early 19th century, the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte moved rapidly across Europe, but they still depended heavily on supply arrangements and the ability to sustain their forces in the field. When these logistical systems failed, most famously during the invasion of Russia in 1812, the consequences were catastrophic. The challenges of logistics became even more significant during the industrial wars of the 20th century. Modern armies required enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, spare parts, and replacement personnel. Entire national economies became integrated into the process of sustaining military operations. During the Second World War, for example, the outcome of major campaigns was often shaped by logistical realities. On the Eastern Front, the German army faced immense supply challenges as it advanced deep into Soviet territory. Long distances, poor infrastructure, harsh weather conditions, and constant combat placed enormous strain on German supply lines. At the same time, the Soviet Union relocated large parts of its industrial base east of the Ural Mountains, allowing it to continue producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a massive scale, despite losing significant territory during the early stages of the war. The United States also demonstrated the power of industrial logistics during this conflict. American factories produced vast quantities of ships, aircraft, vehicles, and other equipment, supporting Allied operations across multiple continents. But logistics is not only about industrial capacity, it is also about organization and planning. Moving supplies from factories to ports, across oceans, through rail networks, and finally to frontline units requires complex coordination involving thousands of people. Small disruptions in these systems can have major consequences on the battlefield. Modern military planners often emphasize that logistics determines the pace at which armies can operate. An army may possess advanced weapons and well-trained soldiers, but if it cannot sustain its forces with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, its operational capabilities quickly decline. This reality has remained consistent across centuries. Even in the era of satellites, drones, and digital communication, the basic requirement remains unchanged. Armies must be supplied. And maintaining those supply systems is often one of the most difficult challenges in warfare. Why military power has limits. One of the most important lessons that appears repeatedly throughout military history is that military strength alone rarely guarantees the achievement of political goals. Armies can win battles. They can destroy opposing forces, seize territory, and apply enormous pressure on an enemy state. But wars are not fought only for battlefield victories. They are fought to achieve political outcomes. And those outcomes often depend on factors that extend far beyond military strength. This distinction between military operations and political objectives has been discussed by many military theorists. Among the most influential was the Prussian officer and military thinker Karl von Clausewitz. In his famous work, On War, Clausewitz argued that war is not an independent activity. Instead, it is deeply connected to political purposes. Military force is a tool used by governments to achieve political aims. But this relationship creates a problem. Even when an army performs well on the battlefield, the political goals of the war may still remain difficult or even impossible to achieve. History provides many examples of this tension between military capability and political outcomes. Sometimes powerful states possess overwhelming technological and military advantages, but still struggle to achieve lasting success. This does not necessarily mean their armies are ineffective. Rather, it often reflects the complexity of the political environment in which wars take place. Modern conflicts frequently involve multiple actors, complex social dynamics, and competing political interests that cannot be resolved through military force alone. To understand how this happens, it helps to look at several conflicts where strong military powers faced limits to what their force could accomplish. When strong armies face difficult wars. One frequently discussed example is the conflict between the United States and North Vietnam. Another case that is often discussed in military studies is the long Soviet intervention in Afghanistan during the 1980s. The conflict began after the Soviet Union launched the Soviet-Afghan War in support of a friendly government in Kabul. Soviet forces possessed modern armored vehicles, aircraft, and artillery, but they faced an insurgency composed of decentralized resistance groups operating across difficult mountainous terrain. As the war continued, Soviet forces struggled to control rural areas and prevent insurgent fighters from receiving support across international borders. The conflict gradually became a prolonged and costly war that placed increasing pressure on Soviet political leadership. These types of conflicts demonstrate how geography, local political dynamics, and the nature of insurgency can create challenges even for large and technologically advanced armies. Why wars often last longer than expected. Another pattern that appears frequently in military history is that wars tend to last longer than political leaders initially expect. Before major conflicts begin, governments often anticipate relatively short campaigns that will quickly achieve decisive results. However, once fighting begins, unexpected complications often emerge. During the summer of 1914, many leaders believed the conflict that became the World War I would end within months. Instead, it developed into a 4-year struggle involving mass mobilization, industrial production, and enormous casualties. The initial expectations of a rapid war were quickly replaced by the realities of trench warfare, logistical challenges, and the difficulty of achieving decisive breakthroughs. A similar dynamic appeared during the early stages of the Iraq War. The initial invasion in 2003 rapidly removed the Iraqi government from power, but the years that followed involved a prolonged period of insurgency, political instability, and complex security challenges. In both cases, military planners faced situations where the initial phase of combat operations was only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated process. This pattern occurs for several reasons. One reason is uncertainty. War involves incomplete information about enemy capabilities, intentions, and resilience. Governments and military planners must make decisions without knowing exactly how their opponents will respond. Another reason is adaptation. Opponents often change their tactics in response to new circumstances. When one side gains an advantage through a particular strategy or technology, the other side may eventually develop countermeasures. Over time, this cycle of action and adaptation can prolong conflicts far beyond their original expectations. Finally, wars often expand beyond their initial scope. Additional actors may become involved, political objectives may evolve, and the broader strategic environment may shift in ways that were not anticipated at the beginning of the conflict. All of these factors contribute to the unpredictability of warfare. Technology does not remove uncertainty. In modern discussions of warfare, there is often an assumption that advanced technology can reduce uncertainty on the battlefield. Surveillance satellites, precision-guided weapons, real-time communication networks, and digital intelligence systems all provide military forces with unprecedented amounts of information. However, history suggests that even highly advanced technologies cannot eliminate the uncertainty inherent in war. Commanders must still interpret incomplete data, make decisions under pressure, and coordinate complex organizations operating in rapidly changing environments. Military operations also take place within political frameworks that can impose limits on how force is used. These realities mean that war remains a deeply human activity, shaped by leadership decisions, organizational effectiveness, and the unpredictable behavior of adversaries. Technological change certainly alters the tools available to military forces, but it does not remove the fundamental challenges of strategy and decision-making. Continuity across centuries. When historians examine conflicts from different eras, from ancient campaigns to modern wars, they often notice recurring patterns. Armies that adapt effectively to new conditions tend to perform better than those that rely on outdated assumptions. Logistics continues to determine how long armies can fight and how far they can operate. Political objectives shape military strategy and can place limits on the use of force. And uncertainty remains a constant factor in warfare, regardless of technological sophistication. These patterns suggest that while warfare evolves over time, many of its underlying dynamics remain surprisingly consistent. Understanding these dynamics does not provide easy answers about the future of warfare, but it does offer valuable perspective. By studying how past conflicts unfolded, historians and military professionals can better understand the challenges that modern armed forces continue to face.